Today on Legalese, we need to talk about what is one of the most disturbing, unjust, and unbelievable Second Amendment cases I have ever covered on this show. The case of Dexter Taylor is perhaps the most upsetting attack on the Second Amendment we have ever talked about here. So let's discuss how a completely innocent man has just been sentenced to a decade in prison for doing nothing more than exercising his natural and individual right to keep and bear arms, constitutionally protected under the Second Amendment. Hey, greetings everybody, and welcome back once again to Legalese. As always, I'm your host, Bob, and I want to thank you all so much for joining me here today. Now, if you happen to be new to my channel, let me especially welcome you. This is the podcast where we're going to be discussing all things constitutional law, as well as current events in other areas of law, politics, and culture. Now, let me just remind you guys real quick, if you want to find out more about our show, you can go check out our homepage over at legalesepodcast.com. And if you want to stay up to date whenever I post new content, because I don't just post these videos on YouTube, I post to alternative platforms. There's an audio only version of the show. I write articles over on Substack. And whether you want to get notifications for all of those things or just curated content for some of those things, you can do either one by just heading over to legaleshow.com. There you can subscribe to our newsletter and you can get notifications sent right to you. All right. Well, today our video is going to be a little different from what I normally do. This is not going to be a comprehensive case breakdown, nor even really an examination of the law. Today, I just want to take some time to make people aware of this incredibly important case and this incredibly cruel sentence that was just handed down to a perfectly peaceful, law-abiding citizen doing nothing more than making the most of his constitutionally protected individual right to keep and bear arms, who has now been charged with a slew of violent felonies. And this is why I want to talk today about the case of Dexter Taylor. Now, earlier this week, Dexter Taylor of New York was sentenced to a decade in prison after a jury convicted him of a slew of violent felonies. But what is really interesting about this is that there were no victims because there was no violence. Now, Dexter Taylor is a 53-year-old man who was arrested in 2022 after police raided his home and found several firearms. Now, Taylor works as a software engineer, but he had taken an interest in weapons science and had started building his own homemade firearms, what are commonly called by some as ghost guns, and these are essentially a firearm made by a non-traditional manufacturer. Now, despite Taylor's hobby being victimless, Brooklyn District Attorney Eric Gonzales would bring a 37 count indictment against him. And in a statement by DA Gonzales, he said, by assembling guns from kits, unfinished parts, or 3D printed components, those who possess ghost guns evade critically important background checks and registration requirements. And because they have no serial number, they are untraceable. And he says the surge in ghost guns in our neighborhoods is a major contributor to the violence plaguing our communities, and my office is working tirelessly to stop their proliferation in Brooklyn. Now, this claim that ghost guns contribute to a significant portion of violent crime is not really something that's backed up by any evidence, but it's also irrelevant because no supposed ghost guns made by Dexter Taylor were used in any violent crime. What's more, home-built firearms are a tradition as American as apple fucking pie. Not to mention as American as fucking apple pie. Now, despite the fact that Taylor did not harm anyone, a jury would convict him on multiple charges, including second-degree criminal possession of a loaded weapon, 4 counts of third-degree criminal possession of a weapon, 5 counts of criminal possession of a firearm, and a second-degree criminal possession of 5 or more firearms, among other charges. Now, it's important to note that many of these charges are considered violent felonies under New York law, even though these are simply paperwork violations. What is perhaps especially ironic here is that DA Gonzales had promised to lead what he called the most progressive district attorney's office in the country, but ensuring a man serves a substantial time in prison for crimes that hurt no one does not strike me as a particularly progressive cause. Now, this decade long sentence should send a message to anyone who, like this defendant, DA Gonzalez would say, would try to evade critically important background checks and registration requirements to manufacture and stockpile these dangerous weapons. He's right, it certainly does send a message, although it does not send the one that DA Gonzalez think it does. It tells people in New York that their judiciary may be more preoccupied with performative prosecutions than with actually keeping their community safe. Perusing a list of Gonzalez's other recent wins, I believe, is instructive. So recently, he secured a 7-year sentence for a man who repeatedly sexually assaulted a young girl, a 3 to 9 year sentence for a man convicted of second-degree manslaughter, and a 3.5 to 7 year sentence for a woman who stole almost $1 million from 9 different people. Now, all of these crimes had victims, and yet all of the perpetrators will still spend significantly less time in prison than Dexter Taylor will. Now, unfortunately, Dexter's, as I found out as I dug into this case, is not a novel case. In November, Sean Craig, another Brooklynite, who fired a gun in self defense after entering his apartment and finding another man inside. Now, while prosecutors deemed this a justified shooting, they still brought several weapons charges against him because the gun he used to protect himself was not licensed by the state. But as I imagine most people watching this are already probably aware of, New York continues to defy the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court ruling in New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin by simply refusing to issue people the state licenses that are required in New York to simply exercise your right of armed self defense. Now, it's already truly perverse to insist that people need some kind of a license to exercise their natural rights, then to deny them that right by refusing to issue them the license that they shouldn't even need in the first place, and then pretend the people are criminals because you are refusing to do the very thing our government was established to do, which is to secure the rights of the citizens. Now, another such example of New York railroading a citizen for doing something that the state ostensibly recognizes they actually have the right to do, which is to defend yourself, would occur in June of 2023 over in Queens, where Charles Forner shot and killed a man who was attempting to mug him. Now, law enforcement agreed that the shooting was also in self defense, and then they brought so many weapons charges against him that, if he is convicted on all of them, this man would serve the rest of his life in prison. And it seems, based on their record of prosecutions, that he will likely spend far more time behind bars than his assailant would have received if he had lived. And also, going off this DA's record, he will likely serve more time for this lawful act of self defense than he would have received if he had been the criminal who murdered a man he was mugging. Now, even more infuriating than the actions of the district attorney was the trial itself. You see, Dexter Taylor came face to face with a judge who actually said the Second Amendment doesn't exist in her courtroom, before he was sentenced to 10 years in a state prison for legally purchasing gun parts and assembling those weapons in his home. Now, this judge, Abina Darke, famously said during Taylor's trial that his lawyers could not make arguments based on the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Now, at one point, she said, "Do not bring the Second Amendment into this courtroom. It doesn't exist here, so you can't argue Second Amendment. This is New York." Though I have to ask, what about the New York State Constitution, which happens to have an identical protection in their Bill of Rights to the Second Amendment? You see, New York civil rights law, Article 2, Section 4 provides that, quote, "a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms cannot be infringed." And New York courts have consistently held that the rights conferred by this provision are coextensive with the rights conferred by the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So apparently, the New York State Constitution doesn't exist in her courtroom either. It's amazing to hear a judge say that the very document that created the government that she has spent her career ostensibly serving simply doesn't exist when it's inconvenient to her ideology. Because if neither the US nor the New York State Constitution exist, she has no authority to cast judgment on anybody. Now, in an interview with Red State, Dexter Taylor said that he was not amassing weapons, as the prosecution alleged. Rather, he was a hobbyist who was fascinated by the intricate workings of firearms. So he said, quote, "I found out that you can actually legally buy a receiver and you can machine that receiver to completion, and you buy your parts and you put them together and you've got a pistol or a rifle." And once I saw that, I was hooked. I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. This is the most cool thing you could possibly do in your machine shop. And he's absolutely right. Dexter Taylor's legal team will appeal, and there is hope that following the string of recent pro Second Amendment rulings by the Supreme Court, including the Bruin decision, that his conviction will ultimately be overturned. Now, I want to share with you all part of a statement that was given by Dexter Taylor just before his sentencing. He said, "Let us show them a soldier's intensity and diplomat's calm. Let our adversaries find us stern in battle, patient in defeat, and gracious in our ultimate victory, which is certain. In short, when our adversaries look for us, let them find reasonable men and irrational patriots." Now, Dexter Taylor does have a page up for those wishing to contribute to his legal defense fund. This is indeed a worthy cause for a good man and a patriot. I will be linking to this page in my video description and on the show notes page. I encourage everyone to do what you can to help get this good, decent man out of jail. And that's really all I have for you guys here today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Legalese. Now, if you could just take a moment and do all of those things for me that help to trigger Al Gore's rhythm, I would appreciate it. If you like this video, hit that like button. If you disliked it, you can hit the dislike button if you want to be a dick about it. You should subscribe to the channel so you always know when I put out new content. And definitely leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought about this episode or this topic in general. I always do really enjoy getting your guys' thoughts on these videos and interacting with you as much as I can in the comment section. So until next time, this has been Bob for Legalese, talking about the case of Dexter Taylor. And of course, as always, Cartago de Lenda Est.
got a trunk full of M's, brother.